I'm incredibly proud to introduce an Air Force Academy graduate and fighter pilot. During his heroic, distinguished 40-year military career, he rose to the highest heights, becoming a 4-star general and a member of the Joint Chiefs and United States Air Force Chief of Staff. That means he ran the Air Force. Prior to that, he served as commander of U.S. Air Forces in Europe, as CIA Associate Director of Military Affairs, and as Commandant of the United States Air Force Academy. Today, Mark presides as Dean of the George Bush School of Government and Public Service at Texas A&M. This man is a soldier who spent 4 decades protecting our country and defending our freedom. There is basically no person on this planet more qualified to discuss national security matters or international affairs than our amazing guest today, my esteemed friend, General Mark Welsh.
Thank you, Catherine. Wow. I want you to try another prayer here. It'll be much better than anything I'm going to say. That was exceptional. And Catherine, thank you for letting me be here. What I really did was serve 40 years with the greatest people on earth and was privileged to do it. And that's about the extent of any accomplishments I had. The great thing about being in the Air Force or really any of the military services is that you work side by side with people who care. They care all the time. They care about each other. They care about the country. They care about trying to do the right thing, whether we always got it done or not. We were trying. And it was just an honor to serve with them. I went in when I was very young because I wanted to go fast. There was no deep thinking involved. I really wanted to see if I could go Mach 1 or more as soon as I could. And I was in love with the airplanes because my dad had flown them, and I watched that growing up, and I wanted to be him. I stayed in because I fell in love with the people, and you know them. They're remarkable, and I miss them. I don't miss a lot of other things about it, but I miss them a lot. Thank you for letting me join you, and Catherine, thanks for the invitation. It is such a thrill to see your mom as well, who is one of the great ladies and great public servants on this planet. Eleanor, you've got a legion of fans all over the country. It's wonderful to see you. Slap your husband when you get a chance for me, okay? He needs that. Let me tell you what I'd like to do, if it's okay with all of you, because I'm talking to a group of people who are very accomplished, who both personally and professionally. You're all role models. You're all people that everyone else looks up to and admires. I mean, you just are. And so there's nothing I'm going to teach you about any topic. So I'd like to have a conversation with you. And I'd like to talk about 2 things. First one, I want to tell you a little bit about what I do now, and I'll explain why that matters in just a moment. I won't take long doing that. Then I'd like to talk a little bit about leadership, because I've had a bunch of people ask me recently to talk about leadership in disruptive times. And they all have used the same title, which I found very interesting. And it won't be a long discussion, but I would like to talk to you a little bit about that, because you are leading right now, and you will continue to lead for the rest of your lives. It's why you're who you are, and why you're on this call. And I just want to share some thoughts by giving you a couple of examples of things that I think are important if you're trying to lead in disruptive times, and introduce you to the people who taught me those lessons. That's kind of the objective. So I'll share a few pictures with you. Okay, let me start by seeing if I can share the screen. You should be seeing a picture of 3 raccoons, sorta. I just wanted you to see what it looks like when a fighter pilot is the dean of a graduate school. The discerning among you can probably pick me out here. It's actually very depressing for me and for everybody else. But it's been an absolute thrill to be here. And the reason it's a thrill to be part of the Bush School of Government and Public Service at Texas A&M is because we get to represent this guy, not his politics. That's not what the school is about. In fact, he insisted on a founding principle of nonpartisanship. It doesn't mean you shouldn't be partisan in your own beliefs or your own thoughts or the way you express your political views. It just means you should be willing to listen to everybody else's position, their views, and their thoughts as well. He really did believe that. It was one of the first conversations I had with him after I got here, before he started to really have trouble speaking. But we want our graduates to leave this graduate school with a master's degree and go into public service at some level. And we want them to demonstrate his professional ideals and try and emulate that respected, respectful form of governance that he lived. He really lived it. He understood that communication mattered, that everybody's voice was important, that diverse views were essential to good governance, and that compromise was the first step toward moving our cities, our states, our country, even our world to a better place. And that's what we want our graduates to go out in the world and do. We have about 370 graduate students here. They're all in a master's degree program for either international affairs or public service administration. Over 70% of them every year since the school opened have gone into public service jobs. It's a remarkable statistic. There is nobody close in the country. And the bottom line is we produce public servants. It's a blue collar land grant school with the goal being produce people who want to go serve their fellow citizens. And our students now come here because that's what they want to do. It is really a cool environment because we've got this giant dynamic university around us that's now going to have 74,000 people on campus, 74,000 students on campus this next semester. 68,000 or so of those are undergrads. It spends over $1 billion a year in research money, and it is scared of nothing. No dollar figure, no big idea, nothing. So it is really an exciting place to be. At the Bush School, we just opened up a new teaching site in Washington, D.C. It's 4 blocks due north of the White House. If you're ever in D.C. and want to see it, get a hold of Catherine. She can connect you to me, and I'll connect you to Jay Silveria, who's running it for us. He's the former superintendent of the U.S. Air Force Academy. When he retired, he became our executive director. So we've got a guy with 4 years of university president experience running that site, and it's right in the middle of downtown Washington. And we're really excited about being there. The competition will be exciting. It'll be hard, but we think we have something to bring. And we can compete, I think, in some areas with Georgetown, with George Washington, with American University, all great schools, but we bring something just a little bit different. By the way, none of them have ever put more than about 40% of their graduates in any given year into public service. Neither has the Kennedy School, neither has the Fletcher School, neither have any of them. And so that's what we bring to the game, and we're really excited about being in it. The other great thing about the school is that our students absolutely rock. I mean, they are just astonishingly good. And they pick us, as I mentioned, because they want to serve. They come here and they buff that up in each other for 2 years, and then they go change the world. It's just a fun place to be. And if you're ever around College Station, Texas, again, get in touch with me. I'll buy you lunch and I'll throw you in a room with 5 or 6 of them. And you can talk about how you have served in your lives, which is a remarkable story for them to hear. I promise they will enjoy that, and you will really enjoy meeting them. Every day when I pick a news show or read something online or look at the newspaper and start to feel bad, I go to the school and I talk to these folks in the hall, and my whole world changes because they are hope. I don't worry about the future because I see it. They're going to be remarkable, and all those things we couldn't quite get right, they will. They have to, and they're not scared of that challenge. Anyway, that's what I do here today, and Betty and I are loving being part of this. Speaking of Betty, even on the worst days, I get to come home to the most beautiful woman in the world who's been standing next to me for 44 years. She is absolutely magic. I mean, just magic. So if any of you are ever looking for someone to hold up as a role model of service to family, to community, to institutions, boy, let me introduce you to my wife, because she is something special. I wish she could be here and join us tonight, but I know she'd say hi, and I know you'd love meeting her. Okay, let me get to the topic, and I'll try and keep this fairly streamlined. And Catherine asked if I'd take questions. I'll answer any questions you have after it. I won't promise they'll be right answers or correct answers, but I'll tell you what I think. When I started thinking about disruptive times, and the first time I started thinking about how do I address this, I'm a military guy, and I grew up all over the world because I was in the Air Force as a kid too. My dad was in for 35 years and fought in 3 wars. And so I grew up on the Stars and Stripes. It was kind of my frame of reference for everything in my life. And I decided, okay, I'm going to figure out, what the premise of this disruptive times discussion that people wanted me to have was, what tools do you need that you can bring out when it gets disruptive? To kind of help you lead your way in your organization's way through whatever is happening. And so I tried to figure out, okay, when have been those disruptive times, and are there traits that certain leaders had that really stood out during that time frame? So I went back at it about a little over 100 years. This is 1918, a headline of the Stars and Stripes. That picture on the top is British Prime Minister Lloyd George welcomed the American Expeditionary Force to Europe. Right below that, that article says first to gain Distinguished Service Cross, kind of highlights the fact that they didn't waste a lot of time at the pier. They went from arriving right into combat in France and were already winning America's second highest award for valor. So the 1910 to 1920 time period was consumed by World War I. The war ended, we turned to the 20s, and obviously life was now going to get better, but the whole world struggled to adjust from that conflict that killed 16 million people. And by the way, an accompanying pandemic that killed millions more. And then in the 20s, here in the US, we were rocked by something that nobody saw coming. I mean, Prohibition spawned gangsters and speakeasies and large criminal enterprises, and you could drink and then you couldn't drink and then you could drink again. And this is what was going on in the 20s. And things just started to stabilize at home and internationally until October of 1929 on Black Tuesday when the stock market crashed. And we rolled into the 1930s, which was dominated here at home by the stock market crash and the economic recovery in this country. Everybody's family has a story about how they were impacted by that. And then, of course, in Europe, the rise of Nazi Germany began, the militarization of everybody in Europe as a result. The Spanish Civil War, where the Germans intervened, and then their invasion of Poland in 1939. And then the 1940s, totally consumed by World War II as we went into another horrible major conflict. And about the time we came out of World War II, we started to put the Marshall Plan in effect. The world started to recover. And now the other side of the world burst out in flames and the Korean War began. The other thing that happened in the 40s is the Civil Rights Movement, which has actually started in the late 40s, began to gain momentum now in the 1950s. And as we rolled into the 60s, the Vietnam War began. And we were back in conflict. And also in the 60s, that flame of civil rights kind of really ignited, and our country was caught in the middle of it. And for those of us who were in junior high school, and college at that time, we have really distinct memories of what that was like in 1967, 68, 69. Much worse than what we're seeing today in terms of actual threats of physical violence for people day to day. There were bathrooms in my high school that you could not go in depending on your color. If you went in, you got hurt. That was from my first day of high school. Just a completely different experience than my children had, which is a wonderful thing. Also in the 60s, President Kennedy was assassinated. I mean, this was not a good time. We come out of the 1960s, Vietnam War is still going. The feminist movement, which had started late in the 60s, really gained momentum in the 70s. And there was turmoil in our country related to that and the issues that it spawned, which were critical issues to look at. The civil rights issues were still winding down about this time. By the way, President Nixon, Watergate happened. President Nixon resigned. Huge turmoil in the 70s. The 80s completely dominated by the Cold War. We completely dominated. My entire first 14, 15 years of military service was focused on fighting the Soviet Union. Everything we did was focused on that. And all of a sudden, at the end of the decade, the Cold War ended. And hopefully the peace dividend was coming. Yeah, except for the invasion of Kuwait and another war, this one in the Middle East. And that conflict continued in the Balkans. And it blew up, not just in Yugoslavia, Serbia, but all around the Balkan region. The 90s were a tough time. The first World Trade Center bombing attempt, remember that truck in the basement? That was in the 90s. And we finished the 90s, we turned the century, and everyone hoped, okay, it's a new millennium. And then in 2001, the global war on terrorism began. War in Afghanistan, eventually war in Iraq. Not good things. We went to 2010, those wars continued. We were now back in Iraq. We were back in Syria now. ISIS began. Remember the Budget Control Act and sequestration. I mean, huge turmoil here in the US, economic impacts, government shutdowns. 2010 and then we got to 2020. And here we are this last year with a pandemic. We've got the pandemic, we've got social justice issues that just roiled everything in our country. We are still in conflict. The global war on terrorism has not ended and has no foreseeable end. So here we are. So I started to think, okay, what are those traits that we should bring out now? Because now we're in turmoil. And it made it very clear to me that we all are always in turmoil. It is always disruptive. And you can take this same story and you can tell this story with businesses in markets rising and falling, disruptive technology occurring and diminishing, stock markets climbing and then either completely having the bottom drop out or declining steeply. You can tell it with technology development. You can tell it in a number of different ways, but we live in disruptive times always, which means that the tools you use as a leader should fit those times. Use them all the time. Don't save a set of them for when it's going to get tough, because it's going to get tough the first day you take on whatever the task is. So let me talk about just 3 things I think are important for leaders anywhere to remember. And I'm going to reemphasize to you that I'm not an expert on leadership. I don't know any more about it than you do. I've probably screwed it up more than you have. But I don't know any more about it than you do. I've just had different experiences. And I hope that all of you are sharing your experiences with the people who look up to you or invite you to have a conversation about this topic. It's a really important conversation, but it's not a complicated one. It's a very human one. And so these 3 things are not complicated things. They're pretty straightforward. But if you're a leader in an organization, in your family, in your community, in your country, and you're not doing these things during disruptive times or all the time, depending on how you want to look at this, then you're probably not doing something you could be doing to help. And the first one is make common sense the first standard you apply. We tend to get wrapped up in policy and guidelines and guidance and directives and all these things that we need to have to be efficient. But anytime those things don't align with common sense, change them. They're wrong. And a lot of Americans don't understand the details of complex things we do as a community, a city, a state, or a nation. But they're pretty good at common sense, and they recognize people who don't have it. And so when we create phrases, when we give stories, when we tell the story from our perspective, if it doesn't make sense to them, they're not going to listen. And they certainly aren't going to be interested in following leaders who can't present common sense solutions to common sense problems. Let me give you an example of this. When I was a chief of staff, I had a chance to visit Air Force people all over the world. This particular picture is of a small airport in Africa, somewhere on the continent of Africa. I can't tell you exactly where. We were doing counterterrorism operations from this base with unmanned aerial vehicles. And there were about 100 airmen who had gone to this place, which is out in the middle of nowhere. And we're operating off this airfield. And the pad right there at the back right, the cement pad back here, is where the airplanes were usually parked. And this piece of equipment you see here is actually preparing the ground for the parking ramp that we eventually built. The great thing about this airport is that the people who went there were very well trained. They were very mission focused. They were very type A, and they were really good at what they did. So the first time I flew in here to visit them, we came in and flew down the runway. We did a low pass across the runway because there's a troop of baboon that would hang out on the runway when nobody was using it. And there were like 500 baboons on the runway. It wasn't 1 or 2. So we did this low pass down the runway. The baboons scattered, jumped over the razor wire that's around the runway, which is just a little footprint in the middle of a jungle area. And we came back around, we landed, we got to the runway, into the runway at the left end of this photo, all the way down the runway to the left. There's no taxiway, so we just taxied back down to this point here to turn into the terminal. And as we taxied, I noticed that all the runway lights were broken. Every one of them on both sides of the runway is broken. And next to each one of them, there was a rock lying on the ground. And I thought, well, that's kind of strange. So we pulled in, parked the airplane, got out and met the gang there. And the first question I asked them was, hey, what's up with the runway lights? And they said, oh yeah, the baboons don't like them, so they break them. And I said, well, what's with the rocks laying there? They said, oh, they just leave their tool there because they know we're going to replace the light. And they don't want to have to find another rock. So we have to press the light and throw away all the rocks and hide them somewhere so the baboons can't find them. Pretty interesting. So I started laughing and I said, well, do you have any other animal adventures here? And one of the guys said, oh, yes, sir. We had a great one yesterday. And they start to tell me this story. And it turns out the morning before, they came out and got ready to start flying, and they regularly do a sweep of the runway to make sure it's clear before they fly. And it wasn't clear. There was a leopard on it, and a full-grown male leopard. And he was lying right after this yellow line that comes out from the terminal here and then turns right into the runway. Right there is where this leopard was lying, right on the center line. And the unmanned aircraft stay on the center line. You can't maneuver them around the center line. They're on it. And so they couldn't start flying until they got the leopard out of the way, because hurting a leopard is illegal in this country. And so they came. I said, so how'd you get off the runway? And they said, well, we had a couple of plans. We said, first plan A, 3 guys kind of said, okay, we'll get it. We'll go shoo it off. And they started walking. And they got about 50 yards out into this taxiway and looked at each other and went, well, maybe not. Maybe plan A isn't such a good plan. So they came back and said, no, we need a different plan than that. That was good. Common sense finally reared its head about halfway there. The second idea, plan B, was that they'll take the fire truck and they'll go out and they'll kind of nudge it off the runway. They'll get it to move because they'll be scared of the fire truck. So they had this old timey looking fire truck there. They got in it. All 3 of them are in the front seat. They drive out. They pull out around this way and they turn and they face the leopard. So they're beak to beak with the leopard right on the center line. And they get right up as close as they can. They're stretching over, looking, down at the ramp to see if they can make sure they don't hit it. And they stop, and this leopard's not impressed. It's not even blinking at them until it looks up and it sees shade under the truck. So it gets up and it walks underneath the truck and lays down. So now they've got a full-grown African leopard lying on the center line with a fire truck on top of it that they can't move because they're afraid something on the bottom will hurt the leopard. So they need a plan C. So they got out of the truck, all 3 of them, and they go sit on the side of the fire truck and they squat down and they're looking at the leopard. So they're about 6 feet from a full-grown male leopard who may or may not have had breakfast, and they're trying to figure out how to get it out front of their truck. Well, luckily on the side of the truck are these long poles with hooks, that firemen use. And so they took one of the poles and they poked at the leopard, because everybody knows if you poke a leopard from this side of the truck, it'll run out the other side. And the leopard literally rolled over on his back and starts pawing at this pole. It's like the kitty loves this game. And they're laughing until he made the "I'm tired of this game" noise, at which point they threw the stick and they all jumped up on the side of the fire truck and they're hanging there. So now we've got 3, all male, these happen to be, you're probably thinking, yeah, no kidding. 3 male, highly trained warriors, very mission focused folks, hanging on the side of a fire truck 3 feet off the ground, 6 feet away from a now pissed off full-grown African male leopard who might not have had breakfast. And they hang there for about 10 seconds and then look at each other and think, okay, we need a new plan. So they drop and they run back up in the cab of the truck. They call in the radio. Now they have plan D, which is a much better plan. And they decide we're going to tranquilize him. So they call in and they get the medical technician, who's a young lady about 22 years old, one of our enlisted med techs, really talented girl. And they said, hey, doc, we need something to tranquilize this thing. So give me a tranquilizer, mix something up. So her only answer is, yeah, got it. I'm sure that was in her pre-deployment training somewhere, how to mix a tranquilizer for leopards. But anyway, so she mixes something up. Now all they need is a tranquilizer gun, but they can't find one anywhere. Nobody has one. There isn't one in this old terminal. They don't have anything. But luckily, they did find a great big plastic syringe. And now all they need is a volunteer. And astonishingly, the youngest person on the deployment volunteered. And he is, no kidding, on his way out, loaded with a syringe in his hand to do the Kathy Bates on this leopard. Because all of us know that if you put this thing in the leopard, he will instantly keel over before he fillets you. Anyway, and then the senior enlisted guy on the deployment, a chief master sergeant, walks into this huddle of people and says, hey, what's going on? And they tell him, and he goes crazy because he brought his common sense to work that day and shuts this thing down and just goes off on everybody. So tells them, get that truck out of there, drive it away. The leopard won't get hit. He'll move. So anyway, they all come back in. And by the way, they have no idea what happened to the leopard. In all his ripping everybody apart, the leopard kind of eased out of there. Really pretty entertaining. I asked them, well, how did he get in? Did you ever figure it out? Because this razor wire is all around the camp. And they said, yeah, we have we found a footprint in a little dry creek bed. We think he came underneath the fence. So we sunk the fence in the sand. We're good now, sir. I said, okay, that's good. 3 days later, I'm back in Germany. I'm reading intelligence reports. And the day before, they'd almost had a hippo strike on this runway. One of their airplanes almost had a hippo. I don't think that dude tiptoed in under the wire, but it was an exciting place. But the moral of the story is a really important one. Common sense will take a vacation. And if you are leading the effort, yours cannot go. Common sense has to be the first standard we apply. In this situation, it could have got somebody killed because people weren't using common sense. But in every scenario I can imagine, from a leadership perspective, common sense has to be the very first standard you apply, and then apply the others that you're required to use. Second thing I think a leader's got to do in disruptive times, because things are so unstable and everybody is searching for some kind of balance. When it gets unstable, leaders should create stability in some way, shape, or form. And every good one you've ever known has done this, if you think about it. Let me give you a fairly dramatic example. This is London in 1940. I can't imagine any place that was more disruptive, or a time that was more unstable. Every night you go to bed, and then the air raid warning sirens go off during the Battle of Britain. You take your family, you go down into the subway tunnels, and you huddle together and hope a bomb doesn't hit the road above you and collapse the tunnel on your head. And you stay there till morning when the all clear finally sounds, and then you crawl out of the subway tunnels up the steps, and you see this on the block you live in. I mean, can you imagine this? Night after night after night. The German army is massing on the other side of the English Channel. You know they're about to invade. That's what's coming next. Everybody knows it. And they've swept across Europe. Nobody can stop them. What do? Nobody really knew the answer to that question until the Prime Minister on a radio broadcast said, here's what we do. We're going to defend our island. We're going to fight them on the beaches. We're going to fight them on the landing grounds. We're going to fight them on the streets. We're going to fight them on the hills. We are never going to surrender. And no matter what anybody thinks about Winston Churchill, these words galvanized a nation. He was their stability. They leaned on him. It's a remarkable example of leadership in disruptive times. So is this guy. The guy in the picture there at the front of the church is Robbie Reisner, who is a retired Air Force officer who was a POW in Vietnam, very well known in military circles. This was his funeral. I had the privilege of speaking at his funeral. Right before me, Ross Perot Sr. gave a brilliant eulogy about his long and dear friend. And as I got up to speak on behalf of the men and women of the United States Air Force, I looked out into the audience and I saw the faces of 40 of Robbie Reisner's fellow POWs and their families who credited Robbie Reisner with bringing them home to them. Excuse me, I'm going to get emotional. At the worst of times in the Hanoi Hilton, Robbie Reisner was their spiritual pillar. He was their professional rock, and all of the POWs from that time frame will tell you he is the reason they came home. Because when the torture was worst, when the war was not going well, and none of them thought they would survive the time as a prisoner of war, Robbie Reisner told them they would. His belief was so strong that they believed, because they believed in him. He was a remarkable man who created stability in a horribly unstable environment. When this service was over, our great Air Force Honor Guard loaded his casket up onto a caisson, and it was pulled by horses, followed by the Air Force Honor Guard and led by the Air Force Band down from this chapel, which is at Fort Myer, Virginia, through the hills, the beautiful hills, really, of Arlington National Cemetery. And as Betty and I walked there with his family and his friends, you could feel, literally, you could feel 400,000 American heroes rising up to welcome him home. I will never forget that walk. And I will never forget the lesson I learned from him about providing stability for people you lead. And the last thing I think leaders need to do that I'll mention to you today, I could prattle on forever. I won't do that to you. Is you have to care, and you have to care enough to serve selflessly. Selfless service really rolls off the tongue. It's a mouthful. I mean, it is a serious mouthful. Every time I try and decide for myself whether I serve selflessly, I compare myself to this woman. Her name is Heather Penny. Her tactical call sign was Lucky. Heather, at the time this photo was taken, was the first female F-16 pilot in the DC Air National Guard. This picture was taken in 2000, in the year 2000. About a year later, she and her father, John Penny, who also lived in DC, had breakfast in downtown Washington like they routinely did about once a month before Heather went out to Andrews Air Force Base for a training mission, and her dad went over to Reagan National Airport and flew up to Boston or New York to jump on one of his United 757s and fly out to California, which was a route he typically flew. He was a former Navy fighter pilot, very famous after he retired for the Reno air races. He was the most decorated pilot in those air races for a long, long time. A few of his records have now been broken. Heather's trying to break some of them. She now races as well. But Heather, that morning, had breakfast with her dad on the morning of 9/11/2001 in downtown DC. And then her dad headed to Reagan Airport, and she headed out for her first mission with the new wing commander at Andrews, a guy named Mark Sasseville. Heather and Sass finished their flight briefing. They went out to the duty desk to get their tail numbered. They were going to go fly and train in that day, the two airplanes they would fly. And as they approached the operations desk, they noticed the TV was on and everybody was staring at it. And they were looking at the same picture those of us who were around back then and can remember it were staring at, of the first tower that had been hit and was burning. The second plane hadn't struck yet. And so they stopped and were caught up in the moment, were staring at the TV with everybody else as they saw the second airliner approach and hit the other tower. They pretty quickly, made the deduction that their training mission was probably off. And so they just stood there and watched the TV with everybody else until the phone behind the desk rang. The squadron commander picked it up. After a second, he put it down and he said, "Sass, Heather, get to your jets. We have a mission." The mission of that unit is air defense of the Capitol. And so they ran out of the building. They got to their airplanes. They started the engines. They taxied to the end of the runway. When they got to the end of the runway, Mark Sasseville called back inside and said, "Okay, I'm ready for the mission brief." And they told him there's a United 757 that was headed from the Northeast to California. It's turned around. It's coming back toward Washington. It's Flight 93, and your job is to intercept it and bring it down before it reaches Washington. Mark answered, "We don't have any weapons on board. This is a training mission." And the answer was, "We don't have time to arm you." So Sass and Heather taxied onto the runway for what she firmly believed would be her last takeoff. And he gave her the mission brief on their in-flight, intra-flight radio. And all he said was, "I've got the cockpit." And her response was, "I've got the tail." And she lit the afterburner to take off on her final sortie, knowing that she was about to ram an American airliner with American citizens on board that she was absolutely convinced was being flown by her father. Because that's the choice that the oath she took demanded of her. She never hesitated. There was never a question. She didn't ask her flight lead if there was another option. She just answered two. Now, Flight 93 went down in that Pennsylvania field before they got to it. So they never had to execute that mission. Her father was not flying Flight 93. A guy named Jason Dahl was, a good friend of her dad. But I have never forgotten the first time I heard this story from Lucky and seeing the look in her eyes when she described thinking she was going to ram this airplane that her father was flying. I am not a selfless servant compared to her. but I want to be. And I think if you're leading in disruptive times, that should be your goal, always. So 3 simple things. They're simple, but they're not easy. But I think leadership is a collection of things that are simple, but not easy. And all of you understand that because you've been leading. But I would encourage you to tell your stories, share your lessons with those who are following behind you. Get them ready for what will be a tough world. Not any tougher than the ones we've seen for the last 120 years, but tough in its own way. This is one more Winston Churchill quote that I like. If you lead in disruptive times, you're going to feel better about it later than if it was easy. I like challenge. I think people who like to lead embrace it. Something else I think they should embrace, just as a final note, all of you are at a point in your life or your career where the jobs you have now or the jobs you're preparing to move into are big jobs. And they're going to get bigger and they're going to consume you. They just will, just like they did me and everybody else who's ever tried to take on these fairly large challenges compared to what we expected to be doing. And one of the things that happens is that we lose track of our own personal priorities and we lose them in our professional priorities. I know it happened to me way too many times. And I try and tell everybody who wants to think about leadership to not let this happen to them. Your family has to sacrifice. Betty served with me. She didn't go along for the ride. We served together. Our children were part of the package. They didn't get to vote, but they served just like we did. But she knew what she was getting into and chose to do it anyway. Her brother was my roommate at the Air Force Academy. He died in a plane crash in 1979. He was best man in our wedding. He was godfather of our first child. He was my best friend. She knew what she was getting into. Never once did she ask me to not fly. So every time I got distracted by my professional priorities and started to be a little bit of a careerist, somebody, luckily, good friends, would slap me around and say, remind yourself of who you are. And I finally kind of came to the understanding that this life isn't that complicated. On the day that I'm lying on my deathbed and trying to decide whether I won or lost the game of life, the fact that I was the chief of staff of the Air Force, or that I was in the Air Force, that I was dean of the Bush School, or that I was anything that I was privileged to do, is not going to be part of that equation. I'll be proud of it all, but that's not in the won and lost equation. If Betty is standing there holding my hand, I won. It is that simple. And I think our people need to understand that. And whenever you can be with your family and focus on them, you should be. Make sure the people you mean the most to you know they mean the most to you. It's easy to lose track of that. We've all been guilty of it. Just one more picture, just because I love the picture. This was President Bush coming home when they brought him down to be buried here right behind the school with Barbara and their daughter, Robin. I love this picture for a couple of reasons. It shows the kind of the grandeur of the nation to have a train dedicated to him bringing a president home, but it also captures Texas because he was a Texan. He spent a lot of time in Maine. You can't convince anybody down here he was a Northeasterner. And this is how Texans showed their respect. And I guarantee you he'd have been proud of this. Okay, I'm going to stop photos here and say thanks for letting me talk to you. And I'll be happy to answer any questions anybody has, Catherine, for however much time you have. And if you don't have any, that's fine with me too. Thanks for letting me be here. It's a privilege.
Oh, Mark, I appreciate you're also adding a few slides at the end. Give me a chance to compose myself. I apologize if my mascara is running. That you are incredible as always. Thank you so very much.